I decided to go down the rabbit hole over the weekend and read through the original AD&D DMG written by Gary Gygax. I thought I'd talk about some of the different design philosophies that go into this book, because, it's interesting to take a look back at where we came from and what changes the system and design philosophy has gone through in the last few decades. One of the first things he discusses after the foreword, which kind of surprised me a little bit, is dice stats, which, that is not something that I would normally expect to be at the front of an RPG, but he's kind of got a point, because math literacy for customizing D&D is very important. You sort of have to understand, why do we roll a D20 and not 2D10? Wouldn't they both add up to 20? They would, but, there's a lot of reasons why we do it this way. And so he kind of has to go through the math and go through what each of the numbers represents and what happens, statistically when you're rolling more than one dice. So I wanted to find some material which I wouldn't find in a more modern day books. So I found the spell explanation section. Now you might be thinking, wait a second, spells aren't those in the player's handbook? And yes, they are. The exact same ones, in fact. But, however, on the player's handbook side, it gives you the bare bones of how the spell works. Very technical. But in the DMG, Gary speaks very candidly and actually kind of tells the DM different ways that they can rule it. He talks more down to earth to the DM going, you could do this, but I wouldn't recommend it. Better to do XYZ. But in addition, having two listings for the spell also provides some hidden information to the player, allowing some effects to be secret to the one casting it. Although that one doesn't come up as often. He mostly just talks about how the players might try and abuse the spell and how to work around that. Some examples are on the description for Speak with the Dead. On the player side, it tells you all the mundane info. But if you go to the DMG side, it's like, yo, your player's going to want to abuse this, but this is how you put a stop to it if they go too far. The weirdest one I saw was in Large, where on the DMG side it explains, hey, since the player's clothes and garment straps split falling off, you can't kill players by crushing them with their own armor when they shape change. Which apparently was a big thing in old D&D, where a druid would polymorph and the DM would go, oh no, you didn't remove your chain around your neck when you decided to change into a T-Rex, so you accidentally crush your own neck and die. Another section, which I thought was fascinating, was taxes. So Gary actually talks at length about how players probably shouldn't be running around with a lot of money, and actually felt that the players should be getting close to zero in between dungeons. Here's an example. It is important in most campaigns to take excess monies away from player characters, and taxation is one of the better means of accomplishing this end. He then goes into detail on all the different taxes they could get charged, fees for banking with people, fees for changing currency. After all, the money is from an ancient civilization, so they probably have to get it changed. Exchanging gems could cost money. Entering the city was cost money. Yada, yada, yada. Point is, everything costs money. So it seems that in this version of the game, the biggest threat to the players was poverty, dying due to lack of rations. So that was the big motivator to going into the dungeon. If they didn't go, their characters would be poor and die. We then decide to talk about time. He then discusses about how keeping strict time is very important in a campaign. As a matter of fact, he says it in all caps, mind you. I will read it. One of the things stressed in the original game of D&D was the importance of recording game time with respect to each and every player character in a campaign. In AD&D, it is emphasized even more. You cannot have a meaningful campaign if strict time records are not kept. So a big aspect of the game is that players were losing money due to living expenses over time, and he actually felt that it was kind of like cheating to not track time, because all these days pass, which they don't have to pay for it. It was also to him this kind of strategic thing where the players can coordinate and they can schedule things. That's the game. That's how he felt the core of D&D should be played. And his mentality was if you throw that stuff out, what's the point? Why keep track of anything? And you know what? He's kind of right. There isn't a point to keep track of rations if you just hand wave it anyway. So then I got to this part, which gave me a bit of a double take. You pack it in for the night. 4 actual days later, and it is best to use 1 actual day equals 1 game day when no play is happening. On day 55, player blah, 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 blah. Okay, so you heard that right. Yes, he is instructing DMs to track in-game days equal to out-of-game days. So the players are out in the wilderness, and they take a break from a session for a week in-game passes. And he even talks about this later, where if you have two groups and they want to meet up with each other, you might even have to have one group play a smaller game to kind of catch up to the other group, or maybe have them, have downtime so that way they could be in the same area on the timeline. He also thought that it helped verisimilitude, because if one group goes out in the mountains for 3 months and returns, the other players have to be doing something, and if they don't, then they need to be penalized for doing nothing. I'm just going to keep reading a little bit more from this because this is interesting. In effect, the key is relative import of the player character's actions in the time frame. Generally, time passes day for day, or turn for X number of real minutes during active play. Players who choose to remove their characters from the center of the dungeon activity will find that a lot has happened while they were away, as adventures in the wilderness certainly use up game days with rapidity, while the shorter time scale of dungeon adventuring allows many game sessions during a month or two of game time. Okay. And then skipping to the end, we're getting to his conclusion. You may ask why time is so important if it causes such difficulties with record keeping, dictates who can or cannot go on adventuring during a game session, and disperses player characters to the four winds by its strictures. Well, as initially pointed out, it is a necessary penalty imposed upon characters for certain activities. Beyond that, it also gives players yet another interesting set of choices and consequences. The latter tends to bring more true-to-life quality to the game, as some characters will use precious time to the utmost advantage, some will treat it lightly, and some will be constantly wasting it to their complete detriment. Time is yet another facet which helps to separate the superior players from the lesser ones. If timekeeping is a must from a penalty standpoint, it is an interesting addition from the standpoint of running a campaign. So, then we're going to move on to the section on social classes. And this one, this section is weird, and it's going to need a little bit of background. Gary Gygax did not have social classes in D&D. And the social class section explains why the players are just adventurers. Like, why do you not have a thing that you can roll on, something you can put points into that makes it that you could be the son of a prince, blah, 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 or any of those other things. And it's basically a kind of a defensive section where he has to sort of explain his philosophy going into D&D and why he designed it that way. Getting into his explanation, part of the reason he left it out was first that it would actually infringe on the DM's freedom to craft the world. And that if they had actually declared, like had some kind of table that says like, okay, this percentage of people are like nobles, suddenly you're requiring the DMs to have all this other baggage that comes along with it. He also explains that he actually felt like adventurers would be, somewhat of the middle class. And he explains it going through like this. In such a society, adventures would come from the younger children of aristocrats, those who will inherit little and wish to remain in the favored class. Some would come from the middle group, adventurous persons who aim at becoming members of the aristocracy through successes in such adventures. Few, if any, would come from the lower class, i.e. bondsmen and laborers. So he's effectively saying that the characters can't be aristocrats because in the book, the reason that he writes is he says that players can't be aristocrats because why would an aristocrat go on an adventure? There's not really a point to it. And then in addition, an aristocrat has like other responsibilities that they'd have. They wouldn't just like, oh, I'm the king of the city, and then just like runs out and goes into a dungeon. That's not what they would do. But I actually don't believe that that's why he doesn't want them. I think that the real reason that he doesn't want a character to start off as a wealthy noble is because it gives an unfair advantage to one of the players. That's what I think is the actual reason. If the point of the game, if you boil it down and say the point of the game is to amass wealth and become a member of the aristocracy and to get connections, you can't start off the game with it, okay? Like, once you open that can of worms, his position is like, well, why wouldn't everyone start off as a wealthy noble? And also, considering that a big part of his campaign was trying to find lodgings, paying for goods, it might even invalidate that aspect of the campaign, because then they could just come back home and just stay at their manor. And so he's trying to say, like, look, adventurers, you're just in the middle class, okay? You start out in the middle. You're not dirt poor, and you're not super wealthy. You're just like the middle class trying to become an aristocrat. One other major feature that you see in AD&D is the inclusion of hirelings, running a keep, owning land, and hiring people to join the group. However, it's interesting because there are actually a lot of rules to kind of direct how the NPCs operate in order to make sure that the players don't abuse these NPCs or overextend their reach. It's kind of for two major reasons. One is like game balance reasons, so that way it doesn't end up breaking the game. But then two, it's also like a verisimilitude thing, because he felt that a lot of players would just like lead them into dungeons, kind of like setting off the traps. And he's trying to kind of rein that in by having, like strict rules in terms of what these things are and what these people are and are not going to do. And why are they going to the dungeon? Now we're moving on to magic items. Reading off a few, there's an amulet of inescapable location, which is cursed to look like it hides you, but actually makes you easier to find. There's the bowl of watery death, which shrinks someone down to the size of an ant and drags them to the bottom of the bowl to drown them, and also prevents them from being resurrected. A lot of these things, when they kill people, they prevent them from being resurrected. The Chime of Hunger. This one is such a magic item of its time. It pretends to be a normal chime of opening, but at some point, when they try to open a door with it, everyone who hears it will be filled with a ravenous hunger, open up their packs, and immediately start devouring their rations. That is an item that was made for a very specific purpose. One which I thought was really cool was the Crystal Hypnosis Ball. It looks like a crystal ball, but when the party member like tries to use it, scries into something, it actually hypnoses them, and the lich or a villain or something takes them over, and they become possession of the party. Gauntlets of Fumbling. They seem like normal gauntlets, but if you're threatened by an enemy, the gauntlets will not let you hold any weapons. And if you're sensing a theme, like one of the things that I do really like about the cursed magic items is that they leave it up to the DM when they go off. They don't actually have like a set pattern. So the players can't kind of logic out which one's which. Plus, what it sounded like is the players were trying to test weapons outside of combat. So these things have restrictions that the cursed weapons only go off when they're threatened or when it's in the middle of the fight or something. Then you also have artifacts. What is an artifact? An artifact is an item which cannot be identified. Okay, nothing works on it. The players must find out what the item can do through using it. Not only that, but the items actually have like these empty slots on it. And what the empty slots are is they're for the GM to put in extra powers. It'll have some like base ability that it can do, and the DM gives it special stuff that like your blade of destroying is different than someone else's blade of destroying. He even has a section on what happens if my players give their hirelings the magic items to test out before wearing them, just to see what properties they have. Because what if someone puts like a thing of fireballs on it, and like, you swing it once, it just like explodes or something. And so the players are very skeptical, and so they would sometimes just give them to the hirelings and then have the hirelings swim around. The answer that Gary gives is one of three things. Basically, it's not going to work. And the reason is for three reasons. One is that if the hireling is either evil or neutral, they just run off with the item. They're just like, ooh, magic item, and they just leave. And they don't give them back to them. But if the hireling is good, it says that the good hireling will find the fact that the player just tried to risk their life testing the item and just run off with it, believing their master to be evil. So whatever you do, don't give your hireling your magic weapon, because they're just going to run off with it. We are then going to move on to combat. We kick combat off first with a roll. A D6 roll. The party rolls a d6 for their surprise, and the monsters roll a d6, and then you consult the chart. What this is the surprise roll. And you consult a chart, and there's like different things that kind of modify it, give it, plus and minus. And then whoever rolled lower loses segments based on kind of the difference. So if both of them get a 1, that's like normal. But if one person gets a 1 and then they get a 6, now suddenly you've lost like 2 segments. Notice I didn't say turn, because in AD&D, there aren't any turns. They have segments. The party gets a segment and the monsters get a segment. First, the magic users go from both sides. They declare the spells they want to cast. Then the melee characters run up and make their attacks. Then finally, after everything is done, the spells resolve. And then you cut to the top of the round and do the other d6 roll again. Just to summarize, magic users go first, then melee, then the spell resolves. And what that means is, it was designed intentionally, is because this is the reason why. If a magic user gets hit while starting to cast a spell, before it's done, that spell fizzles. And it's interesting in theory. Don't know how much fun that would be in practice, but we don't do it anymore, so I don't know. It seems a little bit cool. Now we're going to get to the section of firing arrows into melee. And just so that there's no confusion, I have to clarify that a missile, while nowadays it's mostly used for a specific weapon, a ballistic missile or something like that, it actually is used for anything that is a projectile weapon, hence magic missile. Okay. Now, I would normally read this section out to you, but it's a bit much. I had to cut it from the script because it was just too long. Basically, what happens is that when you fire an arrow into a crowded room or a group of people that are fighting, you take everyone on each side, using size mods of 0.5, 1, and 1.5, assign the group to a value, you add it up, you then split the incoming arrows evenly. So if there's 7 arrows and then like the size values add up to 7, then you split it. But if you don't, then you have to get a fraction, a percentile. But that fraction is not a whole number. It's actually kind of, that fraction is not a whole number, you know, because it's like you're talking about 6 out of 7 or something like that. So what you do is you divide the two, and then you get a decimal place number and you round it. But the way that you figure out how to round up or down is based on facing the side of the room that they are on. One of the examples is that they have in the book is if there's 4 missiles, 4 out of 7, instead of 57.1, you take 4 times it by 14 or 15 based on the directions to be either 56 or 60. You roll to see which side they hit. Then you roll to see which individual on the side that they hit. Then you roll to hit, and then you roll damage. And then you resolve the missile fire. Gary also talks about hit locations, and he, once again, this is another section where he didn't like hit locations, and so he has to kind of explain himself and write, like, this is the reason we don't. And the reason they don't is he felt like it complicated things. Okay, got it, fine. But the major reason he actually felt also was that he actually felt that it ended up favoring the players, because player fires an arrow or like swings a thing, they hit the eye or whatever, and then suddenly it's blinded. Like, it's if a GM like goes to make an attack on someone's arm or leg, it's a lot more complicated, and then even resolves, like, it's something that the player can easily heal. Whereas a lot of the enemies, you know, if you're fighting like a dragon and you cut in the eye, okay, dragon's a bad example, they'll probably have magic, but if you cut like some monster, you know, in the eye, it's usually not going to have any kind of healing magic or any way to kind of fix that, but the players do. And so he didn't want hit locations because he felt it favored the parties too much. I knew that this book was going to be weird, and there was some weirdness that I already expected, and aerial combat was not one of them. So when I was actually originally reading through it, or I'd started reading through it, I started sharing posts on like Twitter, on like, hey, I'm reading through AD&D DMG, here's some stuff. I said, like, taxes, that's weird. And people commented back a lot negative, some positive. But one of the things that I actually really wanted to share on Twitter that I couldn't was aerial combat rules. Because I knew that if I did that, people would be like, hey, Ben, why did you post a massive pile of meaningless words on Twitter? That's really weird. So sadly, I couldn't share them until now. You want to know how characters fly in AD&D? Planes. Everything's a goddamn plane in AD&D. Things in the air have turn speeds, cruising altitudes, they have a takeoff and have to get up to speed, and you got to worry about when they pass each other in the sky, taking pot shots at each other before circling back around to do it again. He even has like different classifications on flight on kind of an A to E scale. Ghosts are classified as A flyers, who can turn and stop on a dime. Because why? Because they're ghosts. What stops a ghost? Nothing. They can just fly. They go somewhere, they turn, they come back. It's a ghost. It does what it wants. Now, you might be asking, can my little hedgehog, Mr. Whiskers, with aviator goggles who rides a biplane made only of bacon turn more than 90 degrees in a round? No. No, you can't, Mr. Whiskers, because that would just be ridiculous. Moving on to alignment languages. It's probably the most well-known, air quotes, quirk of AD&D, but if you aren't familiar with them, Every character has what was called an alignment language. It's quite literally a language that you get from your alignment. So if your character is lawful good, they can communicate with other lawful good. Same with chaotic evil, to other chaotic evil. Gary compares it to Latin and Catholicism, or a rogue's thief can't. Now, this obviously opens up a can of words like, wait a second, I thought alignment was your moral compass. Now it's supposed to be my religion? With codes I have to follow, question mark? Also, can you learn more alignment languages? The book says no, you can't. Why? Because it would just be such a social faux pas that it wouldn't happen. And I want to read that shit out to you because it just gets more funny. Any character foolish enough to announce his or her alignment by publicly crying out in that alignment tongue will incur considerable social sanctions. At best, he or she will be thought unmannerly, rude, boorish, and stupid. Those of the same alignment will be inclined to totally ignore the character, not wishing to embarrass themselves by admitting any familiarity with the offender. Those of other alignment will likewise regard the speaker with distaste when overhearing such an outburst. At worst, the character will be marked by those hostile to the alignment in which he or she spoke. I like to take a moment to appreciate this weird social engineering that the GM is doing here, calling the character foolish for trying to talk to a dude using an alignment language. He seemed to have a very narrow focus for what he wants it used. Another interesting commonality of the book, which we rarely see, is that the use of what can only be described as kind of like NPC social engineering in order to maintain game balance. There's even several times in the game book where it dictates how NPCs are supposed to act in order to maintain game balance. And you don't really see that kind of thing in modern books. For example, it lets the GM know that all NPC wizards do not want to share spells with the PCs. And there's a reason why he does that. It's because he doesn't want them getting more spells than they should. And he even brings up, like, the hirelings don't want to give up their spells. Which brings us to game balance, which stood out to me a bit. A lot of times Gary says stuff like, hey, don't do this because it will break game balance. And it makes me realize, actually, from that perspective, that I think most designers would not want to qualify their game as balance. There's several reasons why, but one of them is that it's almost like a cook being like, my food is delicious. Or perhaps it's also that balance is such an elusive beast that no one wants to declare that they've found the balance. Or it might even have to do with such an idea that each individual game will have its own balance, which, I mean, it's partially true, but like there's a reason we have a rule book. Newer editions of D&D don't really talk about homebrewing, and in this one, Gary says, I would discourage it, but GMs are going to do it anyway, and if you do, it needs to be balanced. Now, the other perspective I want to take a look at this game is I talked a lot about what is in the book. Let's talk about what's not in there. There really isn't advice on how to make a villain or campaign design. It's much more focused on the dungeon and that they're filled with traps and gold and monsters and how to run the monsters and how to run combat. It seems to be from the perspective that that narrative will unfold, you know, if there is a narrative, or even that, you know, that is the game, is like going to the dungeon and coming back, and that's the story. He had a much more concrete idea of the world, who was and was not an adventurer. And I think that nowadays, you know, it's like a lot more design is kind of more open in terms of what is and is not defined by the game. Anyway, thank you guys. I really appreciate it for coming down this rabbit hole with me and reading through the book. It was a long one. It was probably one of my longer videos, but I definitely felt like this one had to be done. And there was a lot of stuff that I really wanted to talk about, and I'm glad that we got through it. Okay, thank you. All right, goodbye.